Good evening. Welcome back to our discussion on creation versus evolution. It's been a week for you. It's been about 5 minutes for me. At one point I thought that I was going to come and change out shirts, so you try to fool everyone to thinking that it was, a week later, but that's not really the case. We're going to continue. We were doing a review of the first 2 weeks that this lesson was done back in March. We didn't quite finish that review. The last slide for that set of classes is going to be the first one we're going to talk about tonight. And then I promised to slow down. We're going to be a little bit more thorough. I do suggest that anyone who was not with us those first 2 weeks in March, to go back and look at those original videos. They are available online. So our content, talking about creation versus evolution. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. God is seen in all of his creation, and we have no excuse. We are without excuse because we see his glory and his power and his presence everywhere. But there are those who would try to explain away the glory of his creation to natural causes. And so this is what we are discussing in this series. Evolution. Certainly this is not a foreign concept. You've heard of this before. And it is becoming ever more present in our society. Just by way of review, our theological arguments, the arguments for God. Of course, this is in addition to the evidence we see in creation and the evidence that we see in His Word. But the theological arguments stand as the cosmological cause and effect, the teleological intelligent design, the anthropomorphic fine-tuned universe, the moral argument, objective morality is not natural, and ontological, God must exist in order to be conceived. We talked about the cosmological argument last week. We are going to be talking about the teleological argument and perhaps the anthropomorphic tonight. And again, by way of review, evolution, by definition, change in allele frequency over time, genetic frequency over time. This part is absolutely true, but it is just the basis from which extrapolations have been made to very false teachings. We see, if we break down into evolution, we're going to see cosmological evolution, the origin of matter, the Big Bang. This is what we talked about in the last class. We're going to be talking about today organic evolution, the origin of DNA, protein in the first cell. Microevolution, also known as natural selection, survival of the fittest, a mutation, and then macroevolution, also known as speciation. So we're picking up tonight where we left off, and this was actually the last slide of the first 2 lessons back in March, the teleological argument. So this is an argument for the existence of God, also known as intelligent design. The idea being that if you see complexity and purpose in the design of something, then it requires that someone of greater intelligence has designed it, has put it together. It could not have happened by accident if you can see intent and complexity. Now, it's possible to see complexity without the necessity of a designer, but to have both complexity and purpose, functionality, intention. You have all those things together, you must have a designer. Of course, the most famous example of this, if you see in your bottom left part of the screen, the little pocket watch. Last time in March, I brought my own little pocket watch, and we talked about how the original argument said this pocket watch, if we were to say that this pocket watch was found at the site of a large explosion, could we reasonably conclude that the energy released from that large explosion and the material around it, that this watch was popped into existence? It was assembled purely by chance and by energy and having the resources that it would need to be to develop. So that obviously would be ridiculous. We see that this watch has design. It has someone who created it. It did not happen by accident, by chance, by chemical reactions, by energy and random action. This had design. This was assembled purposefully with a specific purpose. But we see this in nature all the time. Although it's trying to be explained away, we see in the human eye, as you see in the picture in the top left, the human eye is such a complex thing. The fact that we can, as a biological organism, see things, that we can receive light bouncing off of all these things around us, and we can interpret what that means. Not only what it means, what it is, what color it is, how far away it is, if it's moving towards us or if it's moving away from us. It's amazing the functionality of the human eye, or the eye in general. You see the eye in whales being even superior in its functionality. There is intention there. There is complexity and intention. An amazing functionality that just does not come about by accident, by random chemical reactions. It just doesn't happen. Not even with the ideas that we will talk about later of natural selection, which is the basis of where they claim that this complexity comes from. You just don't get this type of intention, this complexity, functionality with a purpose by accident. It just doesn't happen. And something interesting, if you'll ever see any information on this, in the top right corner you see a picture of the bombardier beetle. Now this thing has two different chemicals that it produces, separate chambers in its body. Neither one of these chemicals, by the way, serve it any purpose by themselves. They're not used for metabolism or digestion or anything like that. They are produced and stored separately within the body of this beetle. But if this beetle is attacked, it will flush these two chemicals being held separately into a mixing chamber. And inside this mixing chamber, I can't even really see from this distance looking at my slides, but the temperature that it goes to is amazing. And it mixes, it creates this explosion in the face of the attacking animal or the predator that's after this beetle. Now, of course, it has a great purpose to defend the beetle when put together, but think about those two chemicals separate. I mean, if they don't have a purpose, if they're not benefiting the beetle any being developed separately, why would natural causation, why would this beetle have developed these two separate chemicals without having foreknowledge that the mixture of these chemicals would create a desired effect? Now, you could say, well, the ending of it, yes, there's a purpose there, but there was no purpose for these to develop naturally by themselves. The beetle didn't know that mixing these two chemicals together would create this effect and decide to make these chemicals. That's not what happened. So we can see here that this is divinely, this is intelligence beyond the beetle and beyond the natural biology of the beetle. This is planned. This is purposeful. This has an effect that was designed. We also talked about with the common evidence of functionality and intention, symbiosis. When we talked about termites, and we all love termites here in we're not in South Georgia anymore. I'm from South Georgia, so I'm used to saying that, but Georgia in general, apparently the idea is that if you throw a piece of wood out into the backyard, that there'll be termites in it near about before it hits the ground. They're all over the place here. We're not a big fan of them, but there is something interesting that happens with the termite. The termite has in its belly, in its intestines, or where it processes, digests the wood particles. It has a bacteria that is unique to the inside of the termite, and it helps the termite to digest the food particles. The bacteria could not survive without the termite. The termite itself nourishes the bacteria. The bacteria breaks down the wood particles to nourish the termite. One could not live without the other. So which one could have developed naturally first? By chance, by natural mechanisms? Or does this not show intention? Does this not show planning, design? And then, of course, the bee to the flower. The bee uses the flower to create nectar, or I think it grabs the nectar and creates honey. It nourishes the hive. They use honey in the beehive for all these different things that are necessary for the survival of the bees. And the flowers require the use of the bees to spread pollen to populate, without which the species of flower or plant that produces the flower would die out and go extinct. So the bee needs the flower and the flower needs the bee. Which came first? How could they have developed separately by natural causes? Was this not planned? Was this not designed? So this is the idea of design requires a designer, intelligent design. We see that, of course, this is the hand of God at work. This is even, the types of things that we discover, the things that work in the natural world in such complex ways, especially when you go down to the level of the cell, the individual cell, and the amazing mechanisms we see there at play. We can see that this is just beyond even our own intelligence to design. There are some mechanisms, some motors even, like electric motors built into cell membranes that is beyond our technology to do. The amount of information that DNA can hold in the nucleus of a cell is greater than the capacity of our most powerful computers. It's beyond our intelligence to design things like we see in the natural world. Obviously, this is not something that occurred by chance, even by natural mechanism. So now moving on to new content, we're looking at a breakdown, the second piece of the breakdown of evolution, organic evolution. So we see that design in life, biology, living things, requires a designer. So this is evolutionary's response to that. It says this is how things came to be. Now if you look in your top right corner of the screen, you see a flask there with a funny top to it. It's called a swan nose flask. There was a man by the name of Louis Pasteur, the guy who discovered pasteurization, and that's what we use for milk. That might be what seems familiar. Louis Pasteur designed this swan nose flask to defeat a common misbelief in his time. It was believed by the scientific community very strongly up until that point, the idea of spontaneous generation. Now, what is spontaneous generation? The idea that life could come from non-life. See, what they would do back then, they would leave a jar of rotted meat out in a container, and then they would come back the next day and find maggots. And their explanation for that was that with sunlight and air and the basic components of life in that rotted meat, from that generated spontaneously life. These maggots spontaneously generated from the basic components of life that it needed, with air and with light, and all these came together to form life out of nowhere, not life from non-life. So what's funny is that in science books all over, you'll see how this concept that Louis Pasteur developed this flask, and the reason for the flask was that he said, well, if you closed up a nutrient broth, and say it was about bacteria growing at that point. So he put this nutrient broth in a flask, and he put a stopper in it. And guess what? Nothing grew. Well, he said you have the components of life. You have light coming through this glass flask, but there's no spontaneous generation. This is not a true concept. And they said, well, you didn't let air get in. So this is where the whole bottlenose flask came in. He made this funny nose on the end that would not allow bacteria to get to the nutrient broth, but it would allow air to go through, to prove his point that spontaneous generation was a false idea. Immediately after, science books will tell the story and explain how spontaneous generation is false, and it's even comical that people used to believe this. And just after that, they'll talk about, but it apparently did happen at one point in history, because that's where life came from in evolution. So they'll prove that spontaneous generation doesn't exist, and then tell us, but it did once. So let's think about what spontaneous generation would require. The first cell, the first form of life. If we look at the most basic form of life, and I have a picture of a cell up to the top left part of the screen, You see some DNA, some protein, a cell membrane, some cytoplasm. The very basic components of the cell, you have to have some instructions to produce something, produce the parts of the cell that it needs to survive. Those proteins that DNA codes for. It needs a membrane. Well, actually, this is the next slide. So, by the way, I have a side point under spontaneous generation. There is no evolutionary evidence for spontaneous generation. This is just a hypothesis that was developed to try to make sense of the idea of evolution, life from a natural means without the existence of God. It seems strange that people would go to such great lengths to exclude God from the picture. You would think, well, perhaps couldn't they take the true parts of evolution and just see where creation fits in, how that fits into creation? But no, they have to go the extra step and exclude God. So it's important to know there is no true evidence for spontaneous generation. It has never been seen. It has never been reproduced. Of course, there are claims that it has been. We'll talk about that here in a moment. But there is no physical evidence for spontaneous generation. Quite the opposite. So what does it take to make the first cell? What would it require? Well, a cell, the first form, the most simple form of life, would require first a membrane, because if you are not separate, if a life form is not separate from the environment, then you are the environment. You are just proteins and amino acids and things floating in water or space or whatever. So you have to separate yourself from the environment in order to be, as a very basic component of life, the first cell. That cell has to have a way to produce and utilize energy to perform a function. So we call that metabolism. Now, the next one, reproduction, that's not a requirement for life in the most simple form, but if you did have a cell that had spontaneous generation and you developed a cell and it had no way to reproduce itself, well, we wouldn't be talking about it today, right? So if evolution was true and there was, we all came about by these natural causes, well, if that first cell that spontaneously generated didn't have a way to reproduce itself, then nothing can be passed on. Nothing is going to spread and develop into more complex life anyway. So yes, we have to have reproduction in order for this to make sense for evolution. These three things, which it actually is much more complex than that, but these are the most basic components to that first cell. For it to spontaneously generate by chemical reactions in a nutrient broth, it would take about 256 genes, which encoded for proteins, and each gene averages around 1,500 base pairs in an exact order of 3-point sequence. This is adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine, uracil. This is genetic stuff, I know. I'm not expecting every piece of this to register, but just to show the scale. 256 genes, which all encode with an average of 1,500 base pairs, 3-point sequences in exact order. The proteins averaging between 466 amino acids in order, with 23 variants. The math comes out to the likelihood of that happening is 5.7 times 10 to 720 power. Now that's an unimaginable number. That's, it's like more than the number of atoms in all the universe. It's an unfathomable number. The odds that by random chemical reaction could organize into these very specific sequences, these base pairs, the order, the number, were required for the most basic components of life. All that said, the numbers, the math says it just cannot happen. It cannot happen randomly by chemical reactions. The first cell cannot be made by itself. There is no such thing as spontaneous generation. So, there was a debate a while back between biostatisticians and evolutionists. Because the evolutionists looked out at the universe and they saw pictures like this Hubble telescope picture, and they said, well, wow, all these stars, all these possible habitable planets, just the huge nature of the universe, and all this potential for life. Certainly, there's more life out in the universe. There has to be. They were setting up SETI back in this time. They were looking for extraterrestrial life, and they're saying certainly there has to be life out there, because the universe is just so vast, and if it has the components that it needs to spontaneously generate life, well, it's bound to happen because it happened here. Well, then the biostatisticians came back and with all their formulas and statistics, and they said, well, the odds against spontaneous generation, like we saw before, that number is just too big. It's just so, it's beyond unlikely. It is impossible. Statistically, mathematically impossible for spontaneous generation to ever happen, regardless of how plentiful the resources are, how expansive the universe is. So he pulled together a formula. This is a Dr. Andrew Watson. He considered, even over the time span of 13.8 billion years, even with considering the billions of planets, possible planets, the stars, the galaxies that we saw in that picture, they calculated all these up in estimates. We don't know really what's out there because we can't see everything, but they took estimates on how big the universe is, how many galaxies, how many stars, how many planets, took averages. He said, even considering all that potential, and even if you take all that potential and you give it 13.8 billion years, the odds of producing intelligent life, 0.03% chance. Now, in the world of statistics, 0.02 is a very significant number. It is considered beyond statistical significance. It basically means in the world of mathematics, it doesn't happen, even when you consider the vastness of the universe, even if you give it the time frame of 13.8 billion years. So it was funny, I was talking with someone earlier today that all fairy tales begin with the line far away and long ago, or long ago and far away. All these fairy tales start with the same phrase. Well, the idea is that it's hard to verify anything that happened long ago and far away. So, they're saying, we'll give you the 13.8 billion years, we'll give you the billions of stars and possible planets and habitable zones. It's not going to happen. So this was an interesting debate a while back, but we can see just the impossibility of life coming from non-life. On the other hand, one thing that is very much supported, something that has a great deal of evidence, is biogenesis. And that is the simple fact, it is a law in biology that life comes from pre-existing life of the same kind, which is to say that people do not produce dogs and cats do not produce baby humans. Baby humans do not come from rocks or non-life, inorganic material. It's the simple fact that life begets life, and to the same kind, or with shared genetic traits. And this flies also in the face of macroevolution, which we'll talk about later. Life comes from previously existing life. It does not come from non-life. It does not come spontaneously through chemical reactions. It just does not happen. So here's the problem with that. There has been, I remember in college, they had a whole chapter about this particular experiment, and they had the great claim that scientists had reproduced life from non-life. Scientists had proven that the microaerophilic environment, the reducing atmosphere of the early Earth billions of years ago could produce life. And they have done this in the lab. Did this really happen? So what they're referring to is the Miller-Urey experiment. So what they did in this experiment is they took a nutrient broth full of amino acids and nucleic acids and just the right pH and the right all the right components there, right? And they added heat and condensing and They made it, kind of fanciful in their language. They had an electric spark as if it was a lightning bolt in the early earth in that atmosphere. Really, they just, gave it the optimal conditions for a chemical reaction to occur. And a chemical reaction occurred. Yeah, they linked up some amino acids. Not to mention that they didn't encode for anything. They had no function, and they were in the wrong order. Yeah, they linked some amino acids together, and they made the claim that they had proof of spontaneous generation of life. Obviously, you can see how silly that is. The Miller-Urey experiment did not prove spontaneous generation. It proved that with an intelligent designer, you could make a chemical reaction happen. You can link some amino acids together to make a protein, certainly. And we synthesize proteins all the time, scientists do. That's where you make vaccines and all kinds of medicines and things like that. So yeah, that can happen, but they were far from creating life in a laboratory, and they certainly did not prove the existence of spontaneous generation. So that's where we're going to stop here at this lesson. Thank you for being with me. We'll be back again with another video next week. And I pray that you have a great evening and have some level of inspiration from the idea of the greatness of God and His creation, as is my hope.